I'm so pleased that all of you are here today. You may be asking what ISPS is, besides this beautiful blend of historical and modern architecture you find around you. And so I'm glad you asked. We're an old institution. We're even older than me. We were founded in 1968, and I was founded in 1971. I was actually founded, it turned out, well, maybe not founded, but brought into this world 9 days later than the Congressional Black Caucus, which had its first 9 days, which had its first meeting. Excuse me, 9 days before the Congressional Black Caucus, which had its first meeting on the 12th of January, 1971. Coincidence? I don't know. So one last digression on the subject of age. When my daughter was around 9, so this is before my 40th birthday, when I still like to call myself lower middle-aged, my daughter said in a moment of anger, "Dad, you're so old, you're older than the oldest hedgehog." So I looked up hedgehogs. They have a lifespan of 2 to 5 years. The oldest hedgehog on record, this is true, is named Packy. It lived in Florida, and it made it to 10. So in some ways, I think that was a compliment and not a criticism. So back to ISPS. We have a long tradition of supporting political science and social science research. Most recently, we've been known for our work in field experimentation. And since I assumed the directorship in 2011, I've been trying to bring ISPS somewhat closer to its original roots when it was founded in this moment of enthusiasm about the ability of the social sciences to address pressing public problems. And so I've been seeking to promote high-quality social science research that speaks to such issues, to train the next generation of policy leaders who can work on these issues, and finally, perhaps most important, to use this research and these young leaders to try to actually influence policy. And so this week is a really special week for me. It's the week in which I begin to see all of this paying off in a really big way. Earlier this week, I introduced Governor Dan Malloy at an event at the law school, and he was introducing his proposals for a second chance society, a society in which crime is controlled without destroying the life chances of some of the most disadvantaged segments of our society. Now, Malloy already had a track record on this issue that's pretty impressive. Crime is at historic lows in Connecticut, at the lowest point, in fact, in the last half century. And meanwhile, Connecticut's prison population is down by about 10%. Its minority prison population by about 15%. Its juvenile justice population down by 80%. Which makes Connecticut really the leader in the nation. And this is just an enormous and enormously positive development, and the governor wanted to build on this success. He's proposing to eliminate mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug possession. He's creating an expedited parole hearing process for nonviolent low-risk inmates, an easier road to full pardons for ex-inmates, automatic post-prison employment that combines basic education with skills training and supportive housing. In short, he's trying to do the things that haven't been done for the last generation to make our society both safer and more humane, and a place where every person born can have a fair shot at the American dream. Now, we're a long way from that, and we're going to learn more about that today. But it makes me really proud and happy that the governor came here, insisted he would come here to make this announcement. And it makes me even happier that a month before he came here, he was in the room across the hall with our top criminal justice experts, many of whom are in this room, many of whom will form the backbone of the new Center for the Study of Inequality that we're launching with this meeting. The purpose of the center that Veshla Weaver will be heading is to promote high-quality, multidisciplinary research that can inform policy discussion regarding the relationship between inequality and major features of our democracy. And I have to say that Veshla's leadership, her decision to come to Yale and to take such a leadership position in setting up this center is one of the greatest developments since I've directed ISPS. She is, of course, a scholar of amazing ability herself, but the fact that she's willing to invest so much in creating an institution that can support the scholarship of others, that can create spaces where we can talk about these issues, that can bring students and others into these conversations, and ultimately that can spread the work that we're doing out into the community and into our democracy. All that is something that I value deeply, and I'm very thankful to Veshla for what she's done for this institution and for our society in taking on this charge. The center is going to be different from other centers on inequality, and not just because it's going to place racial inequality at the heart of its mission, but also because we're really thinking about the relationship between inequality and governance. Too much of the research on inequality sees it as a problem of unequal incomes or unequal wealth alone. And this is really a story about how our democracy is changing. And we want to think today and going forward about how the rise of inequality and its many manifestations over the last generation has shaped how equally and fairly citizens feel responded to, or actually responded to, their faith in the political system, how much voice they have in the public sphere, and other fundamental questions that I fear have not been asked enough as this dramatic social transformation has occurred. So the center will be doing a lot of things. It will be doing events like this. It will be bringing in fellows and people in varied social science disciplines to talk about and do work on this research on these issues. And it will be thinking throughout on how, not just on how to do good quality research, but to spark fresh thinking, new ideas about policies that could restore the strong link between democratic governance and well-being, human well-being that once marked and really, I think, set apart our democratic system. So I will let Veshla tell you more about the mandate for this conference, but I want to just mention one of the initiatives that we're undertaking with the new center. And these are what we're calling rotating research working groups. I'd like you to come up with a better title than that, which will involve 6 to 8 faculty fellows who push forward thinking about how we measure, understand, and intervene in a prominent area of inequality. And the first one on the events in Ferguson and what they signal will be headed by Tracy Mears and Ben Justice along with Veshla. And so I'm very grateful to Ben and Tracy, who we will be seeing soon for taking that charge. So you're at the beginning of a great adventure, and hopefully a very happy adventure for us. And I'm grateful for your participation and your enthusiasm. But I don't want the end of this day to be the end of your involvement with the center. We want you involved. We want you to lend your ideas, your wisdom, your scholarship, and above all, your passion to this venture. And so, without further ado, I give you someone who's bringing lots of passion and wisdom, scholarship, and ideas, Veshla Weaver. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jacob, that was perfect, and I owe a great debt to Jacob for seeing this initiative, not just seeing it, but seeding it, putting his time, energy, and money behind the ISPS Center for the Study of Inequality. Not just that, Alan Gerber at the Center for the Study of American Politics here has also lent resources to this undertaking. I'm also thankful to my dear colleague Jackie Goldsby, who, though she's on leave, is not only here but sat down with me and talked through what this event might entail. And this is in large part due to that brainstorming. I'm also thankful to the panelists, who many of whom don't know each other, because I saw this as an opportunity to bring together experts that needed to be in conversation with one another. So thank you, panelists, for not only braving this crazy New Haven cold, but also coming together in an interdisciplinary fashion and taking the charge that is actually kind of difficult for scholars to do, because we like to hypothesis test, of pushing beyond that and actually offering up policy interventions and ideas. So thank you. Back when I had just graduated college, I had taken a little intern position at the Southern Poverty Law Center down in Montgomery, Alabama. Well, those of you who have ever spent time in Montgomery, Alabama know one thing. It is blazing hot in the summertime. And so I had borrowed a Ford Bronco to drive the distance from Washington, D.C. down to Montgomery. And some point in between D.C. and Atlanta, I actually lost my air conditioning. So every day on my drive into the Southern Poverty Law Center, I would roll down all 4 windows, and I would get on the highway. Now, I wouldn't have remembered this, except that every time on that drive, I would pass by this little plot of land that was surrounded on all 3 sides by roadways that had been built around, literally fencing in this community. And what was so striking about this drive, and I'll never forget it, is the screams and the running, flailing women pushing their strollers across this little highway, running for their life as the cars would speed by at 60 miles an hour. And they were doing that because nobody had figured out not to build a highway around a little housing project. Otherwise, these houses were unremarkable. I never would have remembered this, except for how those women would run just to get to where they were going, maybe the convenience store, maybe their jobs, maybe their daycare centers. You see, the women crossing my path that day, they were poor and they were black. And they lived in that triangle of land without crosswalks, so close to these modern conveniences right across the way, and yet so distant and so harrowing to get to. Now, when I went to go see the movie Selma recently, I had forgotten all about this, and I was reminded of it when I saw the image of these legions of black people marching across that big, big bridge together, fearing for their lives, and yet with great fortitude that they would ultimately get across, that democracy would eventually bequeath to them the ability to traverse their communities unencumbered and out of danger. Yes, you might be thinking this is a strange analogy. It's different. There were no dogs or guns or nightsticks behind the women that were crossing across the Montgomery Highway. But you see, history is a very tricky thing. They were also running for their lives. They too were uncertain in their personal security and in the ability to get across to modern conveniences unmaimed. They too could not lay claim to integrated neighborhoods or to the protection of the state to keep their bodies safe. Their faces too were marked by both incredible fear but also fortitude. They too lived within the broad expanse of America's democracy, so close to everything we take for granted, and yet so harrowing to get to. Now, these two scenes, decades apart, beg the question that is central for today. Why, in the aftermath of one of the most transformative civil rights and citizenship revolutions, do we still find ourselves across the highway, across that little expanse of land that we can't quite make it to the other side? How might we dismantle that invisible fence that has encircled this community? And what policies and practices and ideas and cultural shifts need to happen to arrest the persistence of racial inequality in America today? How can we explain and respond to such widespread racial inequality in the absence of explicit, intentional racial animus and bigotry? That's the question for today. Now, the reason I started with those women that were darting and flailing across the highway is that their prospects often remain quite out of view in this post-racial moment we find ourselves in, shrouded in this celebration of how far we've come, how post-racial we are. without diminishing the civil rights victories. After all, they led to the reason I'm here. They led to my father being able to get married to the person he wanted to access a small business loan, and to move out of the neighborhood he wanted to leave behind. Without diminishing those victories, though, racial equality often means what my spouse Chris LeBron has called the triumph of acceptable minimums, or what Lonnie Guinier, who you'll hear from later today, has called formal equality and nothing more. And I don't say that lightly. Yet my aim in bringing us all here today is not to bemoan how broad that highway is, how far we have to go, or how little we've come, nor is it to celebrate how nicely paved it is today. That is a sort of weary debate. My aim in bringing us here is simple: to explore the prospects and dimensions of minority flourishing in the United States so that we can embark on a project of American democracy and equality that reaches beyond those formal protections that were bequeathed to us by the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and others. We may not all agree on the right questions to ask or the right variables to plug into our regression analyses or even how high the hurdles are, but at least I hope we can agree on that project is a worthy one. Now, the story of the running women highlights some important contradictions that I want to start with today. They're not the only ones out there, but they're the ones that came to me in thinking about this sort of disparity and similarity between Selma and the Montgomery Highway. Marginality has for certain evolved. We're at a moment of both sustained, impressive cultural progress and yet yawning substantive gaps. First and foremost is the tension between formal political equality, the hallmark of democracy, and what some have called political standing and influence. I don't have to pay a poll tax, as my grandmother paid $1.50 in Virginia. And yet, many of my generation can't take part in our democracy because other mechanisms of exclusion have been erected. Things like voter ID laws, and we're going to hear from this panel on this, to broader developments, one of which is the vast and stunning expansion of the carceral state and the carceral system that took its first breaths just in the shadow of the civil rights movement. Now, those of you who know me know that that's what I've been up to. That's what I've been studying in the past decade since my Montgomery moment. Maybe it's been a little longer than a decade. So frequently, I get letters in my Yale University mailbox from prison inmates that say, you know, in red font, stamped with, this is from X and X correctional institution. And I got one just the other day. And it said, I feel like I was sent here not to be punished, but to be destroyed. Okay? So that's the first paradox. Second is the contradictions between physical space and social distance. Vast majorities of the American people now support the ideal of integration. So vast that we've dropped those measures from our surveys, our social surveys. And yet, in most of our nation's metropolises, 70% of us would have to move tomorrow, relocate neighborhoods to achieve integration. This generation goes to college in some of the most diverse educational spaces in our history, but because of deeply entrenched racialized poverty, Yale in the midst of New Haven, its black members could fit the description and in an instant go from being a regular college student to a suspect. Third, despite accompanying a widening of legal rights and political rights, those at the bottom are still informally regularly denied access to economic opportunities and resources. Marginality has evolved. The contradiction here is going from a situation of being what Jennifer Hochschild calls equally unequal to what Kathy Cohen calls advanced or doubly marginalized. Almost half of blacks and Latinos had no assets 20 years ago. The exact same proportion is true today. And yet, those at the top who were able to grab hold of educational opportunities, it's now 1 in 10 today have over 250,000 in assets, whereas 2 decades ago, none. The proportion was 0, okay? The overall link between race and life chances has weakened, but that link at the bottom of the class structure has tightened. Now, without race or ethnic status having lost any of its importance, advantaged blacks and Latinos now live in quite different circumstances from their poorer counterparts in ways that were simply not true several decades ago. And we're beginning to see that their policy views and political commitments are beginning to diverge. And I say this because it's important for the kinds of coalitions that then can form around racial inequality. If the experiences and policy preferences of the best off, the best situated blacks and Latinos do not mirror or break from the policy preferences of the worst off, those trends may not bode well for collective action on behalf of the poor blacks, those who Bill Wilson famously called the truly disadvantaged, who will have lost crucial coalition partners in the struggle for economic equality. The Civil Rights Act, and this is my fourth and final contradiction, the Civil Rights Act and subsequent policies and policy interventions had a crucial legacy. They set our gaze on intentional malice and explicit acts of discrimination by bad actors rather than cumulative and economic and entrenched disadvantage, creating an environment in which arguing for racial equality became more difficult. Perhaps this is why many black and Latino youth today no longer say discrimination, explicit discrimination, is a major cause of inequality. And yet they still feel hemmed in by its long tendrils. For example, in my research, as one person told me, the system don't fail you no more. He was talking about Jim Crow. The system don't fail you no more. And yet he went on to say he was a member of what he termed the little people. He said, if you don't know nothing about computers, if you don't got no college degree, you little people, you got to stand on the sidelines and hope that something come out. And what's the most you're going to get? Filing, sweeping up, something of that nature. But if you in that situation, you hit, though. In other words, he didn't have the language to talk about a new system except to say the little people, because the system doesn't fail you anymore. There's no longer explicit acts of discrimination to him. But these contradictions and limitations left to us by the Voting Rights Act legacy aren't fixed. I truly believe that. We're at a moment where the carceral state is, for the first time in my lifetime, coming under sustained attack from both the left and the right. Vast demographic transformations at our doorstep that could result in what one sociologist has called non-zero-sum mobility. And the idea is that for the first moment in a long time, the exiting of white baby boomers from substantial employment positions leaves open a gap which can be filled by blacks and Latinos, if we have the political will to grant those people educational access. We won't settle all of these questions and all of these contradictions I've laid out today, but I do hope we will embark on a conversation together that can set an agenda for researchers, advocates, journalists, and policymakers. So without further ado, again, thank you so much for coming out today, and we'll hear from the first panel on voting rights and political inclusion. I do want to make one logistical note, and that is that we will go from here to Lonnie Guinier's lunch, which is actually in a different building about 1 block away. So we can all follow each other out, get your coats, but it's not in this room. It's 1 block away where we'll be at seated tables for lunch. Thank you so much, and welcome. Please come up.
the full screen?
All right. So now I move into my moderator role. And although I'm on the far left here, I'm going to be moderate. So I am very pleased to be able to convene this panel. It's a really, truly great group. And rather, you guys have all the information in front of you about backgrounds and qualifications. So I'll just say that, Keith, I had not known this until I looked at your CV, but you and I were 1 year apart, graduating from college. So you were 95 in government, and I was 94 in social studies. So, but that is not anything more than an observation. So it's great to have you here, and we look forward to your presentation. Keith also deserves commendation for one of the best titles I've ever seen in an academic article, which is Jim Crow 2.0. That's good.
Question mark.
Question mark. Oh yeah, sorry. It's even better with the question mark.
Right. The Fox News.
New report you just saw?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I just want to begin by saying that it really is an honor to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. So what I'm going to be speaking about today is, as probably most everyone in here is very familiar, in 2011 there was a real rash of voter restrictions that started passing across a wide variety of states. When I talk about voter restrictions here, I'm referring to a wide variety of policies, including photo ID requirements, proof of citizenship requirements, various regulations on the registration procedure, restrictions on absentee voting and early voting, and then restrictions on participation by felons. And so despite very high volumes of proposal for many years before 2011, there was very little actual passage of these bills going on until 2011, at which point we saw a real flurry of these bills passing, and then a very high volume of passage in subsequent years. The kind of volume across states varies enormously. So many states have done nothing. Many states have passed 1 or 2 bills, and then a smaller handful of states have been really, really active in very aggressively moving their states in a much more restrictive direction in terms of the number of hurdles and barriers to their state election systems. So the question that was put to the panel was, how should we theorize and respond to these new barriers? So I'm going to talk very briefly about some of my own research on this topic, and then try to spend most of the time talking about some ideas about responses. So I've done a couple pieces trying to look at basically where and why are these bills passing, focusing specifically on state characteristics that are associated with the passage of these bills. So I had one piece, the Jim Crow piece, that looked at legislation that passed between 2006 and 2011, and then another one looking at 2006 to 2012, sort of updating that prior analysis. And so our findings are really pretty blunt and straightforward. So the states that were more likely to pass these bills were those under full Republican control, those that were more competitive in the Electoral College and under full Republican control, those with larger African-American populations, and those which had seen larger increases in minority turnout in the previous presidential election. And so because these analyses, most of the action is in 2011 and 2012, what that means is states that saw larger turnout in 2008. Those are the states where larger minority turnout in 2008 is where these bills were more likely to pass. So we basically found it really hard to find any other explanation for this than kind of a Republican-led effort to suppress Democratic-leaning and minority voters specifically. And so we controlled for other factors. We controlled for Democratic turnout. We controlled for voter fraud to the extent that that can be measured, and these were not associated with the outcome. The measure for voter fraud, by the way, suggests, as does all other empirical research on voter fraud, that rates of voter fraud are really infinitesimal, and it's an extremely rare event. But the best existing measure that we had was not associated with the passage of these bills. So the very small amount of press that this study got, a lot of it had this tone to it. This kind of like, yes, the Center for Studying Obvious Things finds X. So that, although it's still important to kind of empirically establish things, right? So we're social sciences. So recently I've been trying to look at this in a way that maybe isn't as intuitive or maybe a little more surprising to people. So this is looking at an index of the accessibility of state election systems by state racial composition, specifically percentage African American. And basically, this is just an index. If you have, do you have ID requirements? How easy is it to register? Do you have early voting or not? Do you have no excuse absentee, and so on? And so states that have higher values have more accessible systems. So there's a very strong negative correlation between state racial composition and the accessibility of state systems. And so what I was trying to look at is what has been the effect of changes that we've seen just in this very short period of time up until 2014. And so unfortunately, the strength of this negative correlation has increased by about 15%. So now this correlation is about 0.55, which is, in social science, an extremely strong relationship. And the one positive thing I'll say, which is bad for my graph but good for the world, is a number of these changes, after I made the graph, were stayed by courts. And so not all of these things are in effect. So I should definitely mention that. Okay. So I'm not... I had a moment of optimism last year, and I'll talk about that briefly in a second, but I'm getting less optimistic about where this is going future years. And one of the major reasons for that is I think there are extremely strong structural pressures on the Republican Party to continue to engage in suppression, and a number of incentives that have not changed, and I don't see them changing very soon. So there's the changing demographics of the electorate problem that should be familiar most. And there's also this issue of this incredibly strong positions on immigration and reproductive rights because of the strength of the evangelical base and the Tea Party base in the Republican Party. And despite constant discourse about how the Republican Party now recognizes that they need to moderate on these issues, it doesn't actually seem to be happening in practice. And so I don't see them actually resolving this problem well. And so if you can expand your base, you suppress your opposition, right? That's classic voter suppression, or the classic research on voter suppression suggests that. Okay, and then there's this kind of ongoing momentum from all the attention to the voter fraud myth, of which there are many true believers, it seems, within the Republican Party. Okay, so turning to this issue of responding. So one obvious thing is that there currently are a lot of efforts being made to help people respond to the new electoral environments that they live in, getting them the IDs that they need, helping them understand the new registration restrictions. Those kind of efforts are good and obviously should continue. There's also been a lot of aggressive efforts to challenge these laws in the courts. And initially, there's been a lot of victories, and those are good and those are substantive. But this has been really mixed over time, where some of these laws are standing, some of them are surviving, some of them are moderated a little bit, but still are essentially in effect. And a lot of this is still going on. There's a lot of challenges still in play right now. And so I don't want to downplay the successes because they're important, but I think components like some form of voter ID in many states is here to stay, and that's not going to go away. And I think a lot of these victories for voter ID have kind of suggested that those are going to be with us for a while. At the level of the state legislatures, last year I was going around sounding this very optimistic note, and the line I was selling was that the net effect of this effort by Republicans, this Republican overreach, has provoked this Democratic backlash, and this Democratic backlash is pushing for there to be these expansive reforms in all these democratically dominated states, and the net effect is going to be to bring more people in that are being restricted by these restrictive laws. I've now, over time, come less excited about that possibility. One of the major reasons is while there was this huge explosion of proposal of expansive voter reforms by Democrats across the country, not as many of those as I expected actually ended up passing. Secondly, while some of these reforms are really big, like same-day registration and online registration systems, many of them are relatively small-bore things that aren't necessarily going to increase participation in an extremely dramatic way. The other reason I'm not super optimistic about state-level reform is this is a map of Republican state legislative control following the 2014 midterms. And so Republicans now control 70% of state houses. This is the largest proportion of state houses they've ever controlled in the history of the party. And this is likely to be with us for a while. This also undermines the ability of all that Democratic proposal I was talking about before that now is probably what's happening in many cases in states that are now controlled by Republicans, and much of that is dead in the water at this point. Furthermore, the stuff I'm reading more recently is suggesting that Republicans in states that now have a new Republican majority are looking forward to passing voter ID and other types of voter restrictions. Okay, so the other thing I want to say is that when I'm starting to think about this problem more recently, I'm getting very concerned that voting rights advocates and people on the left generally are spending a lot of energy and a lot of effort playing defense, right? Pushing back against these laws at the state levels. And that is incredibly valid work and should be happening and is very, very important. But what I'm afraid of is that, in a way, we're fighting to restore this extremely problematic status quo ante, right? Where if we got rid of all these laws, we'd still be back in this situation where we have an extremely flawed election system that has, very differential access, especially along racial lines across states. Okay, so I've been pushing myself to try to think very hard about how do we push ourselves into a place where we are thinking big about how to take the offense on this issue. Okay, so these are just some suggestions, and some of them might be controversial, so just give me a break if that's an issue. So I've been trying to think about what are federal election reforms that could change election systems nationally that would kind of subvert or obviate or sidestep all this room states have to manipulate their voting systems. And so if we're thinking realistically here, we have a Republican-dominated Congress for the next 2 years at least, so nothing will happen. I have no optimism about that at the national level. And so let's imagine that Democrats take back the Senate after 2016 and the Republican majority shrinks a little bit in the House. Then you're in a situation where if you can bring over a handful of Republicans, you might be able to do something substantive at the national level. And so that's where this idea of kind of offering concessions on the voter integrity issue, right? Voter integrity being the concerns about voter fraud. Because I think that you can structure some of these things, like a national federal ID card, right? Like a federal voter ID card. You can easily structure those things in ways that do not suppress people. You can make them free, extremely easily accessible. You can have a digital camera at the polling place. If you don't have an ID, we take a picture of you and we send you your card, right? We have the technology. It is possible to do this in a way that doesn't discriminate against people. And so if you say, okay, you're so concerned about voter ID, let's have the federal government implement this, and then you combine that with major substantive reform, such as an election day holiday or national permanent lifetime registration. Similarly, the proof of citizenship, right? If you care about proof of citizenship, okay, let's make national lifetime registration. When you're born, you're a citizen, you're registered for life. Every time you interact with a federal bureaucracy, we update your address, right? And they're going to say, oh, big brother, yada, yada. But if you're so concerned about having citizenship requirements, you can't have both, right? You can't say, no, we can't track you. But anyway. Okay, and then maybe online voting. I have to think that one through, but that also kind of removes a lot of this interface with state institutions that can possibly discriminate against people. Okay, the other thing, these are major reforms, and this would require enormous pressure on Democrats and Democrats to have some level of control in Congress. And so in terms of shifting the Democratic Party on this issue, so the Democratic Party talks a really good game about voting rights, but I think that they would need a lot of pressure to actually follow through on such enormous substantive reforms. And so I think there's a really strong lesson to be drawn from the experience of the Tea Party and the Christian right. And what they've done is they entered the Republican Party, the institution of the Republican Party and the state parties, and they managed to really transform the agenda of the state parties very, very effectively. And that combined with traditional social movement activism like protest has been an extremely effective combination of tactics to produce outcomes. And I think there's something that something like that can be emulated by voting right activists. In addition, I think there's this issue of there's current movements concerned about the Black Lives Matter movement. There's also this campaign finance reform movement going on right now. Both are about discrimination. Both are about access. I think there's easy connections to build. And furthermore, I think there's a very strong argument to make to the movements that voting restrictions reduce the power of social movements to operate through electoral politics, right? So it's harder to make a credible threat at a politician if a lot of the people who are part of your movement actually can't participate. And so that's another reason to say you should also take on this issue as well. And then last, when you look at what the right has done in the last few years, is they built this imaginary narrative about voter fraud, fear-mongered about it, and then really shifted public opinion and managed to really achieve major substantive policy changes as a result of that process. I think there's a similar way that attention could be brought to the real problems of racial inequality and access to electoral systems and voter suppression as real problems in this case that we should be concerned about and we should respond to with real substantive policy change. And so building that counter narrative, and I know people are doing that and they're trying to do that, but kind of amplifying that and doing that more consistently. And I think there's been success in kind of debunking some of the voter fraud narrative, right? But it hasn't been replaced with something else that pushes us in a more positive direction in terms of policy. Okay, I think I'm out of time, so thank you very much.
Jeez. Thank you. That was both very efficient, and I love that you took the slides that are usually the thing that people throw into their talks in the last like 30 seconds and made those a big part of the talk, because that's really what this conversation is about, so thank you very much. Okay, so, and Jamel, are you using the slides?
I'm not using
So, Keith, could you just hit the, how do we turn off the screen on this? That's fine. Let's just leave
Can
it
I
there
do
for
that?
now.
Oh, is there a mute? Is that?
Oh, yeah. No, don't worry about it. It's
Okay.
fine. Sorry. In PowerPoint, you can like press B and it goes away. But okay. So anyway, without further discussion of technology, I'm really happy to welcome Jamel Bouet, a staff writer for Slate.
There's actually no accent. It's just buoy.
I'm sorry.
Very American pronunciation.
You should have corrected me earlier. So I've read Jamel's work. As you can see, I've actually never met him, so I didn't get the pronunciation right. And I'm actually on the board of the American Prospect, which laments every time we have a board meeting losing Jamel, who's just an amazing journalist and someone who's been really taking up these issues in both a thoughtful and provocative way. And I look forward to hearing the thoughtful and provocative remarks you have today. So thanks.
Thank you. Glad to be here. So I'm actually, in Keith's presentation, there was a slide showing state legislative control and that sea of red. And I'm sort of discussing how we got to that sea of red and what sort of the implications are, especially in the South and especially for African Americans in the South. Because it's an interesting story of shifting coalitions over time, and it's something that I think has gotten extremely little attention in national political conversations, despite the fact that even if you're narrowly focused on electoral politics, it really, really matters. And so, to start, in 2009, after the 2008 presidential election, state legislative control was much more balanced than that. You still had the consequences essentially of the 2006 Democratic waves and the 2008 Democratic wave. And so Democrats controlled 17 state houses. There was balanced control in 24, with either Democrats controlling the governorship or the state legislature or some combination of that. And then Republicans controlled 9. This was true in the South as well. There was plenty of essentially residual loyalty to the Democratic Party in state and local governments, and in places I don't think you'd usually expect. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Virginia, and Tennessee all had divided government, with Democrats either controlling the legislature or governorship. And then in Arkansas and North Carolina, the entire state governments are controlled by Democrats. And that wasn't super remarkable in Arkansas, which, again, lots of just residual loyalty to the Democratic Party. But in North Carolina, it was actually kind of a bit of a surprise. Democrats picking up Senate seats, picking up governorships, and maintaining control of their state legislatures. And then the rest of the states, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, had Republican-controlled governments and had Republican-controlled governments for a while, so that wasn't a big change. And these Democratic-controlled ish southern states weren't liberal places by any means, but they were places where people, and specifically African Americans, had a say in the conduct of state policy, not just policy in their cities or in their counties or localities, but were actual coalition members in building state policy. That is, and we'll talk about this later, but that's a direct consequence of the Voting Rights Act, right? That in the 70s and the 80s, a lot of black people got involved in local and state politics. And it's a bit difficult to overstate this. In Mississippi and Alabama in 2001, there were as many black lawmakers in those two states as there were in the entire United States just 30 years earlier, which is just a sea change in sort of descriptive representation and substantive representation. So, while politics in all of these states were quite racially polarized in the 80s and the 90s, it was true that the Democratic Party had become a genuinely biracial political party. In places like Alabama, in places like Mississippi, in North Carolina, there were white Democrats who were getting votes from white voters and black Democrats who were getting some crossover support, and they were working together in coalition with occasional Republicans in the minority to actually conduct state policy and to use the levers of government to distribute resources to their communities and to ensure that they're getting at least some share of the pie. Southern politics, very notorious for its love of pork, and that pork was being not fairly, but more evenly distributed across the states. And again, not an ideal situation in a lot of ways, but certainly like a much better one than the one that was there before. The 2000s kind of, and really, 1994, but the 2000s when this accelerated, began a partisan shift among Southern whites with regards to their local and state voting. In part because old white Southern Democrats were dying, in part because, national political changes were sort of driving partisanship. You saw a shrinking number of whites supporting Democratic candidates at the local and state level. And you had states like Georgia, which had partisan competition in the 90s, just become entirely Republican, essentially reverse where they were. And that's where Georgia is now. And as a bit of an aside, everyone thought that would change last year, but the 2014 Georgia Senate election was a big disappointment, I think, to a lot of activists and Democratic elites on the ground who were surprised at how durable the racialized voting in the state was. That even someone like Michelle Nunn, daughter of Sam Nunn, could not do marginally better than Barack Obama among white voters in the state. Anyway, so back to this. 2010 midterm elections, we all know that these were a huge wave driven by a sluggish economy, a very painful recovery, public anger over the Affordable Care Act, or at least a very vocal minority that was very, very angry over the Affordable Care Act, and a confluence of other sort of like factors that were big at the time, sort of like fervor over Dodd-Frank, which Republican activists portrayed as another bailout, and so on and so forth. Republicans, we know, took the House of Representatives, National House of Representatives, pretty handily, and the following year was, lots of manufactured crises in Washington, which was fun to experience, except not really at all. In the South specifically, and in those state houses, what happened was an extension of that these were really fully nationalized state elections of the sorts that you hadn't really seen since 1994, the last time you had a wave of this sort kind of sweep out a huge number of incumbents. At the old New Republic, a writer, Jason Zengerle, did a great story on sort of the partisan composition of these Deep South states, and he gets this really incredible quote from a Democrat who had lost his seat in the Alabama State Senate after holding it for 28 years. And this Democrat says very pointedly, people weren't voting against me in 2010, they were voting against that black man in the White House. They were pretty specific about it, only they didn't refer to him as a black man. Very candid. And then Alabama Republicans they didn't pretend otherwise either. Another senator, a Republican, said, anybody who denies that Barack Obama's unpopularity in Alabama didn't help Republicans come to power, it's just not being truthful about it. And so this is what happened across the South. A very racialized, hyper-partisan wave ejected all of these Southern Democrats and replaced them with Republicans, all these white Southern Democrats specifically. In Alabama, in particular, the Alabama House had 60 Democratic members prior to 2010. 34 of them were white, 26 were black. After the elections, there were just 36 Democrats total, 10 of them white, 26 black. And in the Senate, you saw Alabama State Senate, you saw a similar change. The number of black Democrats remained at 7, but the number of white Democrats fell from 13 to 4. And so not only did they just fall into the minority, but the caucuses essentially became entirely black. So at the beginning of 2011, Republicans had kept their control in Georgia and Florida and South Carolina. They had won governorships in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, or for governorships or full control. Virginia had elected Bob McDonnell in 2009, so their weird elections had already settled this. The state had a Republican governor and then split control of the state legislature. This got worse in 2013 after the 2012 elections, where despite Democratic national success and success in statewide elections, at least nationally, Senate elections and such, Republicans kind of entrenched their control in all of these southern states, including North Carolina, where the state made a pretty abrupt shift to the right, which would influence all the voting ID laws that came down in 2013. And then this year, the only, and I double checked this. I'm pretty sure it's correct. If it's not correct, please tell me. Just shout, Jamel, you're wrong, and I will happily take the amendment. But the only place in the South where Democrats have any sort of meaningful control is Virginia, where they have the governorship and the statewide offices. But in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, the states of the former Confederacy, it's just Republican control all the way up. That is it. So, for African American voters in these states, they are in an incredibly tough position. They don't have coalition partners anymore. Not only does the party they support, it's essentially shut out of government, but they don't have white Democrats to work with. They have very few. And they have a Republican Party that is almost entirely white. Whenever back in 2008 and 2012, in discussions of the national African American vote, there were lots of comments about how African Americans are just supporting Barack Obama because he's black. Not true. But it's striking that in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, in these states, you could easily say the same about Republicans and white candidates. That these are identity-driven politics on both sides. With in places like Alabama, Republicans winning upwards of 85-90% of the white vote, and Democrats taking an equivalent amount of the black vote. In these states, Southern Republicans sort of unencumbered by any need for bipartisan coalition building, any need for cross-racial coalition building, sort of just went to town. They gutted public sector workforces. They passed voter identification laws. They sort of, if I'm sure this existed, if there were an actual wish list, checklist of things to do, they did them, and they did them with very little opposition. Let's say the Republican parties had black constituencies. That might have mitigated them, right? You have to negotiate with people in your constituency and your party to get things done. But there's no need for this. They could essentially move without needing to moderate or deal with any opposing or any competing obligations. I think the most dramatic example of this is the fate of the Medicaid expansion from the Affordable Care Act in these states. I think at this kind of 24 states have not expanded Medicaid. That includes the entire South, other than Arkansas, which notably did it under a Democratic governor, and notably doesn't have that many black people. But in every one of these states, in many of them with substantial populations of African Americans who would hugely benefit from the expansion, not just Medicaid, but a functional functional state exchange that was tailored to the residents. No expansion, and no prospects for an expansion. None of these governors, none of these legislatures have any interest in doing so. A couple days ago, Politico magazine ran a story on the Tennessee legislature, and the Tennessee governor who proposed a Medicaid expansion that was tailored to Republican concerns, that said, people have to buy insurance, they're not getting additional subsidies, everyone will have skin in the game. and Republican state legislatures refuse to do it. There's simply no willingness to expand Medicaid. Again, you know, in a different age, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I don't think this would have happened. I think even in places where there was Republican control, there was enough biracial and bipartisan coalition building for a solution to have happened. And now it's done. As an aside, I promise I'll have some sort of solution. I feel like this is barreling towards everything is terrible. So, you know, politics racially polarized. Again, I want to underscore that in Georgia, which is probably less racially polarized than many of its neighbors, 74% of whites voted for David Perdue in that Senate election. 92% of blacks voted for Michelle Nunn. In Louisiana, it was 80% for the combined Republican candidates, and then 94% African Americans for Mary Landrieu, who lost. Yes.
Can I ask you to move to the solution, just because I want to make sure that we have a conversation with the
Sure.
audience, and we're running a little behind.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So solutions now. The short answer is I'm not entirely sure how you reverse this. It really requires sort of a sea change in partisan affiliation in these states. Maybe if under the presidency of, you know, George P. Bush in 2024, we have another war and people get really angry about it, then it will change. But save that kind of macro shift in political attitudes, I just have a hard time imagining. George P. Bush, by the way, Jeb Bush's kid. I have a hard time imagining any substantial change. So I think one thing to begin to think about for liberals, for Democrats, for African American activists, for everyone, is to shift the locus of action away from state government into cities. To cities in a lot of these states where the metro populations are quite large, where they have a significant influence on sort of the lives of their residents, and where it's possible to begin taking action, sort of, if not against state legislatures, at least sort of accounting for it. So I think Texas is sort of like your example here, right? You have places like San Antonio, places like Austin, which are major metropolitan areas that pursue policy that runs counter to what the state legislature does, and it can't overcome the conditions set by the state, but it can at least begin to mitigate them. It can raise minimum wages within that city. These cities can implement ID regimes to make it easier for people to get voter ID. It can do the kind of things that you can't quite accomplish on the state level. And it can provide the basis for building new coalitions for the future, for when you do have an opportunity to begin making change on the state level again. But for the foreseeable future, that's where I think we have to look. Just turning the cities into engines of reform, of progressive reform, and hoping, much in the same way that national Republicans are looking to their states to generate ideas for national politics, Democrats looking to the cities they control across the country in red states to provide the fuel for reform in the future.
Okay, so I feel somewhat uplifted by those final comments. Okay, great. So next up we have Creighton, and the slides, Kareem, if you just click on
Sure.
So Kareem, as you can see, is at the UNC School of Law, and someone who has both a law and political science focus, and so very pleased to have him here today.
Thank you. And thank you to Veshla for being so good enough to bring me to exchange with a group of people that I know a little bit about in a few cases, but nothing about in others. But I clearly have a lot to learn and gain from the conversation. So I'm really excited about that. Even more so, as I told her when she asked me about this, I said, you know, in all these years, I've actually never been to Yale. And it has nothing to do with, you know, Harvard love or anything. It's just I've never had the opportunity. So, again, I'm doubly thankful for the chance to come and present. And I'm going to hope that I know how to do this. But, you know, sadly, either this is not PowerPoint, right? So I'm probably not doing this right.
View, okay.
Ah. Full screen mode, is that?
It's a little bit down. Oh, gotcha. Okay, I don't use this either.
Yeah, okay. I thought it was just me. It's like
We
there are
can
moments
solve
when I
racial
feel
inequality, but we can't work with
I just attributed it to my feeling old all of a sudden, that there's now technology and probably pop music that I don't get. But in any case, thank you really all of you for the opportunity to come and present. I'm usually the only person who's not a lawyer in the room. This is actually, or I guess I am a lawyer, but who's not just a lawyer in the room. Today, I guess I am the person who's sort of a lawyer in the room, and I'm excited to be able to engage those of you all who maybe don't do this a lot, at least from the legal side, but clearly are interested in some of the same substantive issues that I am, and I'm excited to learn as much as I am to at least share my little neck of the woods with you. So today what I wanted to do is actually talk about some of the same topics that have been in Jamel and Keith's conversations with us so far, and it really takes the conversation just a little bit more into the world of courts and ties in a lot of what we've been discussing involving, I think, much of the structural frustration, I'll say, in the area of the South, in particular in the way in which it interacts with the Voting Rights Act. Just as an aside, I grew up in Montgomery and I live in North Carolina, so if you think you know a little something about grief and voting rights, I can share stories with you as well. But what I want to talk today about is this trend I'm seeing in the United States Supreme Court that, in my view, represents an interesting shift and presents some interesting questions going forward about how the court's going to deal with a certain kind of case now that it's seeing more often. And it's where voting rights claims, but not just voting rights claims, are now being brought in a defensive posture as opposed to in an affirmative posture. To tell you a bit about what I mean, think back to some of the laws that Vesely talked about earlier, the Fair Housing Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. All these rules were established by Congress essentially to empower plaintiffs or the federal government in the person of the Justice Department lawyer to go into federal court and seek redress for grievances, right? Usually against a jurisdiction or a bad actor that just was refusing to follow some of the edicts of the 14th and 15th Amendment, to treat people equally regardless of race. Well, in the voting rights sphere, what I've argued, and not everybody agrees with it, is that this was something quite significant. And it was not just about sort of preventing states from doing bad things. It was actually an invitation to do some of the stuff that Keith was suggesting at the end of his talk, which is to sort of transform the way that defendants, potential defendants, do business. That is to say, to embody some of these directives to affirmatively change the ways in which you decide about how you make employment opportunities available to people or how you structure a voting system. That's not quite been the way that it's worked out, unfortunately. On the one hand, we've seen defendants who are jurisdictions all of a sudden start raising voting rights claims, but they've not done it in ways that we've, I think, expected, and certainly the court has not responded to those ways in manners that suggest that the cause of voting rights or civil rights more generally has been advanced. Let me put a little bit more detail on that as we go through, and I'll try not to be too lengthy about it since I know we're pressed for time. I call this trend inversion, inverting the usual affirmative uses of these civil rights laws, and instead leaving those claims to be raised by defendants in a sort of defensive posture. If you're at all thinking about criminal law, if you watch Law & Order, this usually gets brought up in the course of a defendant raising essentially an affirmative defense. So, right, the person who says, yes, I shot the guy, but I had justification. I was mentally insane or infirm. Or this person had a gun and was going to shoot me. Those are things usually that impose a burden on the defendant to prove in order to excuse himself from otherwise unlawful or criminal behavior. In the civil rights world, that works out in a particular kind of way because in our modern era, we are very skeptical about any invocation of race in the manner of a jurisdiction making public policy decisions that involve race. The court has said that strict scrutiny is applicable anytime it reviews a decision where race was sort of the driving consideration. When the defendants usually raise this to say, well, okay, yes, we understood race was raised in the course of making our decision, but we had good reason for doing it. That's sort of the core of the inversion. The point I'm making in these cases, though, in this last section here, when we talk about the civil rights cases where this has come up, you usually see the court approach the question with a great deal of skepticism. Let me just give you a couple of examples. I won't go through them all, but the cases you probably are most familiar with or Fisher, the Michigan affirmative action case, where Michigan says, yes, we took race into account, which would normally be the end of the policy, but we had a very compelling reason for doing it, says Michigan. We wanted to encourage diversity, and diversity we think is only achieved through this particular mix of admissions where we take some account but not total account of race in our considerations. Court has looked at that and sort of voiced a good deal of skepticism. They said it was okay in Michigan, but now we see a case out of Texas where they've sent the case down to the trial court again to actually make some findings that suggest that they're not really all that happy with diversity rationale. That may have something to do with the departure of Justice O'Connor, but suffice to say the court isn't necessarily wholesale embracing the justification that the court is presented with by the university, that diversity is their driving consideration. Another case, which actually is near and dear to this, I guess, neck of the woods, Ricci, a decision out of Connecticut in which the Supreme Court rejects the city, I believe it is, of New Haven's, right? The New Haven city's decision to change the way in which they deal with promotion of firefighters, in their view, because they thought that there were potential civil rights problems associated with the way in which their system was organized. The Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that, because we think actually race still is not justified as a policy consideration based on the way that you organize the policy. In particular, though, the court was really dismissive of the political leanings of the city government, which it said essentially was hijacked by local civil rights groups to pressure them not to apply the promotion exam that was being challenged, that they ultimately changed. And it really, if you haven't read it, Justice Alito's description of one of the civil rights leaders, a minister in town, sounded as though this was a guy who, was like the kingpin of the crime syndicate. And you kind of wonder, I mean, there are a lot of things to be said about the sort of conception of politics, local politics, but it does raise hard questions about what a city may, under any circumstances, do in order to avoid liability under civil rights law. And the court seems to be saying to the city, no, we don't really care about that, nor should you. Race should not be a consideration, even when you think you might be creating problems for African Americans. I'm going to skip the last one just to point out here that I'm suggesting that in addition to these other areas where this sort of inversion is at play, it's true in voting rights as well. I assume, just for the moment, that you all have seen stuff about the Voting Rights Act before, but suffice to say, there are two different provisions, or at least there were. One is an affirmative piece that, again, allows a plaintiff to go to court and seek redress for what we would describe generally as vote dilution. The Section 5 part, which we'll hear, I'm sure, in the next presentation about, which used to be an effective administrative remedy that essentially put a lot of jurisdictions, mostly in the South, essentially in receivership, and said, in order to get a new law on the books, you've got to get clearance from the federal government to assure the new law essentially doesn't leave minorities worse off than before. That was effectively made inert by this case, Shelby County versus Holder, but suffice to say, these are sort of two provisions that are sort of the body of voting rights law that we look at. The Supreme Court's added one other piece of this. I'm going to skip this for the moment. It's just a sort of specification of what vote dilution is. But I want to talk about this piece where the Supreme Court in the 1990s sort of derived a view out of the 14th Amendment that there's a limit to the extent that a city or a jurisdiction can take race into account. This is a case called Shaw versus Reno out of North Carolina, where the Supreme Court says there's a way in which districts can be drawn such that you send negative signals out to the public that the only people who can represent them are people of their same race. And it involved a district that looked a little weird for a number of reasons, not just race. But the court looked at that as an indication that the political process had again been hijacked by racial considerations. And again, consistent with their colorblindness ideology, race, in their view, has no place in the way that election districts get drawn. Yet they come to a place after a few cases that say, well, in the event that you can show that you're showing attention to race, but not because of race, because instead they have sort of strong correlations with political leanings, you can take that into account. So this is sort of consistent with the court's view that partisan wrangling is perfectly fine. You know, if you're a Democrat, you can go after as many Republicans as you want without offending the Constitution. And in the furtherance of that aim, you can actually identify people who happen to be members of your team. And if they happen to be black people, that's all fine by us. Close decision, a Justice O'Connor special. She's no longer on the court, but that's sort of where the law is right now, right? So we see, though, in these cases, as I said in the other civil rights cases, the state tried to justify its claim by saying, look, we drew this district in part to make sure that we're complying with the Voting Rights Act. And the court rejected that claim on the notion that it was not sufficient to say that you just thought about the Voting Rights Act. We need to see evidence of it. And they just rejected the claim, and in this case and in a number of cases, including those out of Texas. So the assertion, the inverted assertion of a Voting Rights Act protection was not observed as being relevant or at least sufficient to justify the plan in Shaw versus Reno. I want to suggest, though, that these are now places where we've seen the court continually more often bringing these claims, and I know I'm short on time, so I'm just going to mention quickly, in redistricting cases, as I mentioned, preclearance and vote dilution cases, all these claims are places where the state says, hey, we're doing this because we want to make sure that we don't get sued under the Voting Rights Act. And the court says, we don't care, it's not sufficient to justify what you've done. There are two exceptions to the rule, it seems to me, so far that we've seen. There's one that's pending. The first one is Shelby County versus Holder. Now, I would assert here that Congress, in some ways, which is the defendant in this case, is saying, look, we think that we've done the work to show that this race-conscious remedy is still needed. The Supreme Court rejects that notion, in fact, puts a burden on Congress, regardless of the point that Alabama actually concedes, which is, yeah, we have actually violated preclearance in a number of instances, and we wouldn't be subject under the existing system to bail out. In fact, Justice Ginsburg says, look, under any circumstance, Alabama, under any version of the preclearance review that you would establish, Alabama would be a bad actor. We want to target them. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court says, well, there's some problem with Alabama coming into the court and actually making the claim that there shouldn't be a preclearance provision, and says, well, the provision has no place. Congress hasn't done sufficient amount of work to show that current conditions justify this sort of review process. So notwithstanding Alabama's bad activity, the provision is at least put in stasis for now. I want to talk briefly, and I hope you'll indulge me just 2 more minutes, about this case that's pending out of North Carolina, where Republicans, as Jamel has described, have taken over the legislature, and they did it just in time in 2010 to draw congressional and legislative districts. And they did it explicitly, at least from their perspective, to satisfy Voting Rights Act concerns. They were helping out black people by recreating districts. This is what they did. The before pictures are on the left. Districts, all of these districts were districts that elected African Americans. All of these districts were districts that were less than 50% African American in terms of voting age population. So these were actually great illustrations of that coalition building that Jamel had spoken about earlier. The left side was a Democratic district that elected an African American in Cumberland County in Fayetteville. Republicans reorganized this district to basically take a neighboring county and only the black portions of Cumberland County, right? If you haven't yet seen Shaw versus Reno, that kind of district is almost exactly the kind of sinewy line drawing that the Republicans did this time around. The same here in Raleigh and Wake County. You start from a roughly normalized district to a lobster-shaped district. Again, less than majority black people, now all of a sudden a supermajority of black people. Finally, in Durham, same story, where I live, right? Durham here is just part of the county, less than 50% African American, now all of a sudden increased beyond 50%, and just taking the African American portions of Durham County. This is that sort of sinewy portion of it. You can see the borders of the district and all of the African American heavy precincts located there. Now, all of this is done in service, say the Republicans, to further the interest of African Americans. Not one African American supported this plan. Not one. But more than that, the Republicans never did the work to actually show that African Americans were ineffective in electing candidates, which is an important feature anytime you try to raise a vote dilution claim. And it was the vote dilution claim that Republicans are saying that they were afraid of. Now, if this reminds you a little bit of the Trayvon Martin story, there is a good reason. What's the reasoned argument for having a justification for taking race into such account? The Supreme Court has told us you better have some evidence to support it. Here's a case where there's very little. In fact, there's a huge amount of affirmative evidence showing that it is not permissible to do. Yet, we are now going to find out whether or not the United States Supreme Court agrees, consistent with the other cases, that when you don't have a justification, a voting rights claim in defense goes nowhere, or whether you're putting your partisan hat on and saying instead that as a Republican, we'll do what we can to protect our Republican friends. Lots of reform to talk about. Feel free to ask me during the questions, but I appreciate your indulgence. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I end up having to be the heavy, but I'm really looking forward to all of us being able to get a chance to talk about these things. And I have to issue the first correction of the day, which I hope will be the last, and that is that, Keith, you were very gracious to nod when I was saying that you had gone to college at the same time as me, but in fact you graduated like some half decade after me, and it was Kareem who went to college at the same time as me. And of course, you both have names that start with K, and like Stephen Colbert, I don't see race. So, but I deeply apologize for the mistake. I know who the next person is, though, and this is Rick Vallely, and
but it's Vallely.
Vallely. I also would like to mispronounce every name of every panelist, just to be consistent.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't see accents.
No, I understand. I figured you were doing that.
So Rick is a very accomplished political scientist and probably most pertinent to our discussion today. He wrote a prize-winning book comparing the two reconstructions. And so without further ado, Rick.
Thank you. Well, when I finished the two reconstructions, this prize-winning book, I called for a renewal of the Voting Rights Act, and then it happened. And it was a near unanimous renewal. And the president, George W. Bush, made a very big deal about the importance of the renewal. And I thought, well, this is good news. I can move on. And then 7 years later, we get Shelby v. Holder, in which the court says, Congress really did a terrible job. And then there's this deafening silence, right? Congress doesn't do anything. And so there's an easy explanation for this, which is that, and there's a lot of truth to it, which is that what happened in between was the politics of voter ID, and that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have polarized over the politics of voter ID, and voter ID has become enmeshed in the politics of voting rights and the Voting Rights Act in such a way that the bipartisan consensus that had existed in 2006 is now impossible. But I took it upon myself to get ready for this conference and also to do something for a journal submission. And so I have a paper if you'd like to see it, and I'd love to get any comments. I wanted to take a look at how various actors talked about the Voting Rights Act in that 7-year stretch. And I was stunned. I'm overstating the word. Stunned is, a little too strong. But I was very struck that at early in the process, in the 2006 renewal, people whom I like, people whom I admire, voting rights experts and lawyers, testified on the Senate side of the process in ways in which they said, this act is obsolete as it's passed out from the House. Now, clearly they had good intentions. What they wanted to do was to use the Senate side of the process to set up a conference in which they thought the bill could be more likely to survive court review. And so they could foresee something like the Shelby decision saying, if you read Shelby, Shelby's all about the obsolescence of the act. And there's a very important case in between in 2009 in the Mudno, which is even more strongly about this issue of obsolescence. But the voting rights experts, the only person who didn't do this was Pamela Karlan, whom Lonnie Guinier worked with a long time ago. And Pamela Karlan is now trying to figure out what to do inside the Obama administration. And so the only person who didn't sign up behind the bill coming out of the House is out of touch with the new realities, right? As it's written, it's disconnected from what we actually need on the ground. Everyone else who testified, all of whom are really terrific people, they all said that the Voting Rights Act, as it's come out of the House, is seriously deficient. It's Nate Persley, a fantastic political scientist and legal academic at Stanford, appended to his testimony an article in which he said that it is is inexcusable to renew the Voting Rights Act as is. And so this process started of thinking about the act as obsolete in this moment. It really is this kind of innovation. It's a conceptual innovation, and it's sort of like a little mushroom inside this moment, and immediately after the Voting Rights Act is passed by the president, this tiny little postage stamp district with files a claim that Section 5 is facially unconstitutional, also asking to be bailed out under a special kind of provision called bailout. And so the meme, as it were, of obsolescence, right, is brought up right away in the first challenge to the 2006 Voting Rights Act, and in a striking, really extraordinary act of judicial marshaling of the court. The Chief Justice gets the entire court, all 9 people on the court, including himself, to say in Namudno that, in fact, there are very serious concerns about the Voting Rights Act as it's written, and that and quotes from these experts and their testimony to buttress the point that the act is out of touch with the new realities, that the act has been enormously successful, that the coverage formula is targeting a part of the country that where the success of the act has flourished in a way beyond everyone's wildest dreams. And he doesn't put it quite that way, but Roberts is a very clear writer, but he's not a poetic writer. And Roberts gets everyone on the court to say this. The only person who dissents, in part, is Justice Thomas, and says I'd strike down Section 5 right now. But what the court does is say we leave for another day the question of the constitutionality of Section 5. For now, what we're going to do is we're going to bail in Namudno, and which is Northwest Austin Municipal Utility District number 1. It has a website, and as far as I can tell, it owns a swimming pool. Which so I urge you to go check out this website because it's an important little piece of the story. So then this all comes roaring back in 2013 in Shelby. Shelby, by now, the liberals realize that they've made a terrible mistake, and so the liberals on the court, and so Justice Ginsburg leads them in a dissent to say there's nothing obsolete about the Voting Rights Act as it was written. This was entirely within the prerogative of Congress. What the majority is doing is very strange. They're not deferring to Congress properly. Just look at the text of the Constitution. Section 2 of the 15th Amendment says Congress enforces Section 1. And she says a number of other things along these lines. She tries to take back the fact that they signed up to this obsolescence view. And by this time, it's gone also viral enough that you find it in survey evidence. That is to say, the New York Times asked people on the verge, on the eve of Shelby, about a week or 10 days before Shelby. It's a good sample of people, and they split. They split in predictable ways. African American respondents are much less likely to say that the Voting Rights Act is no longer necessary, but roughly the sample splits between people who say the Voting Rights Act is no longer necessary, and the other half says that it is necessary. So the obsolescence discussion, right? This is a very constructivist view, right, that I'm offering, which is that elites construct and innovate a certain way of thinking about the act, and then the construction is picked up by other actors, and the lens of obsolescence is applied repeatedly again and again in discussions. And finally, the public picks up on this on the eve of the case. And it's interesting that just a couple of weeks ago, Bob Goodlatte, I think that's how his name is pronounced. Jacob, you know. I'm just joking, of course.
I could pronounce it, and then you would know what it was.
Yeah, right, exactly, right. Goodlatte. Anyway, Bob Goodlatte, he's a Republican in Virginia, and he's chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And at the Christian Science Monitor breakfast, he was asked, because Cantor was talked about how he was going to do something about the Voting Rights Act, and he has a strong working relationship with John Lewis of Georgia. And he said, no, the court said that this was all old discrimination. And so the point here is that for this conference, I mean, in other words, this is about these contradictions that you're talking about, right? There's an entire party, and a majority of the court now believes that the Voting Rights Act has had its day, right? And whatever is left to be done is to be done on a case-by-case basis, right? This is where Kareem's analysis is helping us to see that the action has shifted to the federal courts, and some of it may involve bailing in, and we'll see if bailing in will succeed and whether the court will sign off on bailing in. But essentially, the governance of the act has shifted to the federal courts, and it's shifted under the sign of the relative obsolescence of the preclearance regime and certainly of the coverage formula, and so for us, those of us who are concerned about the state of voting rights, and also there's this other fact which is very difficult to talk about and get around, but it's an important one that has to be dealt with, which is that despite the voter ID restrictions, right, black voter turnout actually has the intent part of it is clear, I think, as Keith showed, but the actual implications of it in terms of deterring people from voting are not obvious yet, right, and they may become clearer in time, but for now, the idea that the act is obsolete and that it's okay, and voter ID provisions don't do anything, and that American democracy is safe, that is part of the challenge for those of us who want to restore the vibrancy of voting rights. We have to not only imagine a new way to talk about voting rights, and Keith's suggestions are incredibly creative. There's a great new book by Doug McAdam and Karen Close, Deeply Divided, which has this discussion at the end about making voting compulsory in the United States, and modeled after the way it works in Australia. So there are all kinds of possibilities. The one solution that, and Veshla's point that this is a conference where ideas can germinate, is proved true in real time. I'm sitting here thinking, damn, I don't have a solution. I should just have this really depressing story. And, it's an APD kind of story, and APD people are such downers, and oh no, how do I get out of this? and then bingo, it occurred to me, during the 2006 renewal, I was active in something called the National Commission on Voting Rights. And Lonnie may remember this as well. The National Commission on Voting Rights was Chandler Davidson's, he was the staffer for it, and it was a citizens commission. And what we need we have to take a leaf, I think, from the hearings of the Civil Rights Commission in the states in the 50s and the 60s, and the kind of thing that the National Voting Rights Commission did, which it can be a movement, private, ground-up kind of effort where we have hearings, and we hold hearings in the formerly covered states, and we try to get beyond the metrics of turnout and number of minority office holders, right? Because people say, what's the problem, right? In other words, Mississippi now has more minority office holders than the entire country had at one point. So what's the problem? But as Jamel points out, the racial polarization and the collapse of any kind of bipartisanship has simply opened up Pandora's box in terms of the willingness of now dominant Republican parties to move forward. And so we need to call that out, and we need to call it out. It will mean a lot of qualitative kinds of evidence, and we may have to figure out ways to metricize it in ways that are compelling and that can be understood easily. But getting voices through the National Commission on Voting Rights kind of model into what the state of voting is actually like, the kinds of things that Kareem pointed out, these kinds of strategies of packing that seem to be in compliance with the Voting Rights Act. It seems to me that that's something that would be a model, a discourse building, narrative building kind of institutional model that I think we ought to consider for really changing the conversation away from obsolescence to the continuing need and the importance and the vibrancy of strong voting rights protections for our democracy.
We have just a few minutes left, but obviously this is just the beginning of a conversation that can continue. I'll put up this just to remind us of our schedule for the day. Or is this just this is just a slide that is nice. I like this. I should have known about this earlier. So
5 minutes we're supposed to have.
yeah, I'm not going to say anything more. Questions? Comments? Yes.
So I'm sorry I missed the first part of the panel, so I can't reference that, but it seems to me that this is an opportunity to think bigger than just reinforcing or recovering the Voting Rights Act. When you showed that map of the different ways in which people can allocate power, it seems to me that we're still stuck with a form of voting that itself is corrupt. Because the way that the people who are in positions of power draw the election boundaries so that they will get re-elected, but not necessarily in a way that adequately or appropriately represents the people in that community. I mean, I think our whole system needs to be reworked. You know, time is running out, and we're still focused, as with Clarence Thomas, on what happened in the 1700s, and we're stuck with that. I mean, this is not the 1700s. This is not the 1800s. This is not even the 1900s. It's time for us to move forward, and I think it would be. I mean, there are so many other ways that other countries allocate power through voting, and I think it's time for us to look internationally to see what else is available and start pushing for a different kind of voting period. I'm not saying that that's going to happen tomorrow, but I really think that it has several advantages. One, if it is finally chosen, more people are going to participate. But second, it's a way of sort of distracting people's attention from the things that are happening, so that even if you had black elected officials drawing districts rather than white elected officials, they draw the districts to make sure they get reelected, not to make sure that they're the people they represent are best represented. So, I mean, I think this is an opportunity to really be imaginative and be international and look at, for example, Germany. Germany is has a system of voting that we insisted they put into effect after World War II. And it's a system of voting in which everybody gets 2 votes, and the 2 votes, one is based on party, and the other is based on where you live. And so you get a very different kind of people who are elected, and it's an opportunity, and people in Germany tend to vote at a higher rate than people in the United States. So rather than trying, I mean, I feel terrible about what the Supreme Court has done to the Voting Rights Act. I was very active in seeing it amended and extended in 1982, and I mean, it's near to my heart. But I think it's also not going to be reinvigorated the way it is now, and it's an opportunity to do some things that are, I think, much more appropriate to the 21st century.
Well, so that seems like a question worth responding to, and I'm particularly interested in, Keith, in your thoughts about how this idea of moving to a federal strategy, whether there's a long-term vision that would involve thinking about different ways of electing people. Just a small question.
I said earlier that I was previously waxing optimistic that this Republican overreach, which has sparked all this movement amongst Democrats that hadn't actually been happening before, right? And I think maybe potentially, right, this is the dark before the dawn, right? I think campaign finance people similarly, right? They look at Citizens United and they say this is the precipitating crisis that will allow there to be a major opportunity for change. So that's part of what I was saying. We have this period of time now at least 2 years where Congress will essentially do nothing on this issue. But that's the place for developing the conversation, the movement building, and then developing the models for what would be major substantive reform. And I think gerrymandering, district reform, I don't know the details of what you can do with that constitutionally, but that would be one of the topics for sure that would be a major, place to look at for change.
Do others on the panel want to say a word or two?
I agree that there actually is a real opportunity going in the near future or the medium term to reconceptualize voting, and this may be a little cynical, but the projections are that by 2050, good chunks of the United States will be majority minority, and you'll have a situation where there's the possibility for interracial coalition building between blacks and Latinos or blacks and other groups with whites in the minority, and maybe that kind of situation creates the impetus for changing voting around, right? When when all of a sudden your group is the one that is locked out of power, then you're going to want to, prior to that, create completely seriously, create safeguards for making sure that doesn't happen.
Historically, that in countries is how it happens.
Yeah. Although it's not always a happy story, and
No.
that's the sort of other part of it. And I take your point, Lonnie. I mean, you've written tons about this, and I think we're all grateful for the contribution. I tend to share this concern. When you look at states like, I was just in North Carolina yesterday, at a pretty interesting conversation where a number of people from ideological poles, different racial experiences, et cetera, were sitting down asking the question, what do you want your voting experience to look like? And in some ways, I think what these discussions rarely think about is what that experience is and what people want it to be. Everybody has a different approach. Everybody has different issues. And what I found to link this to what we've been talking about are two things. One, a lot of people are frustrated with the existing system for a number of reasons, right? There are Republicans who don't like what happened in North Carolina, just as much as there are African Americans and Democrats who don't like that. But I think also people are just frustrated with government not being responsive to them. And I think, therefore, your structural point is one that a lot of people in the right circumstance would be responsive to. The hard thing, and I guess the puzzle I'd love to have a conversation, in later parts of this conference about is, what's the moment that makes that possible? I think I clerked in South Africa. One of the obvious moments where that became possible was when you were transitioning from one system to the other. But that's sort of a quasi-emergency moment, right, where everybody's agreed that the existing system doesn't work, can't work anymore. You can think creatively in those moments. And I have my criticism of the 2006 extensions, just like a number of people, even though I think Congress still had the ability to do what it did for reasons that the court doesn't observe. But what's the moment that allows that to happen? I frankly go back to, and I think it was Jamel's point about at least starting at the local and state level. There's nothing that prevents a city or a county or a state, frankly, from in moments where people are really frustrated, to just say, what can we try to at least move away from what we have? Again, not a huge fan of what California did, but California's movement away from pure legislatively drawn district was a step in the right direction. It was not perfect. But maybe that is an opening to get people to start, experimenting. And in doing that, a lot of people did look abroad. So a citizens-based redistricting commission was one step in the direction. And maybe that's sort of the incrementalist approach that gets to what you're talking about. But I'd agree.
I guess I'm, of the people here, the most inclined to stick with the Voting Rights Act. That is to say that, I'm struck by the fact that Pam Karlan left Stanford to go and work on figuring out how to make the Voting Rights Act work in the Justice Department, and partly I come to this because of an historical perspective, which is that if history is any guide, we're in the second redemption. Right, we're not in another disenfranchisement. We're a long way away from another disenfranchisement, and the 19th century and the 20th century are profoundly different. But one of the things that historically oriented scholars have been struck by in American politics is that it has cycles, that Mark Twain apparently never said this. I tried to find out whether he actually said it. It's always attributed to him, which is history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. So it's a folk theorem. And I say that hoping that there are game theorists and rational choicers in the room. So in other words, one of the folk theorems of American political development is that we do have rhyming moments, and so this history teaches us. I mean, if C. Van Woodert were alive, I mean, if he were still here, I mean, the person who really helped us to see this about American politics, from here in his perch at Yale, that history offers sobering lessons about slow-moving crises, right? And Jacob's collaborator Paul Pearson emphasizes that slow-moving change is very hard to identify. It's very hard to to make it stop and say, look, this is what's happening without sounding kind of crazy. And that's why I have this hope that by actually trying to get a sense from people on the ground of how they experience this kind of possible second redemption that we're going through, then I think we might think differently about the legacies of the Voting Rights Act and building on it and building on the institutional supports and strengths that are there, which gets me to the last point, which is that historical people also emphasize bricolage, right? Which is that you put back together existing elements of institutions. And it seems to me that we ought to see the Voting Rights Act as creating a kind of an alphabet that we can use, or an institutional grammar that we can put back together. So I tend to have the most conservative view on this.
Thank you very much, Greg. So we need fast-moving change right now, unfortunately, because we have to be at another place in roughly 10 minutes. And so Veshel will be, I guess, leading the charge. And thank you. Before we do anything else, we have to thank this amazing panel.